Right, hello and welcome to the last London Learning Lean of the academic year. So there isn't a seminar next week. We'll be starting again in October. But until then, we've got Wrenna Robson from Royal Holloway, who's going to tell us about post-quantum crypto. Go ahead, Wrenna.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about post-quantum cryptography. Or I'll explain a little bit about what that is, and then vaguely why it's relevant to a lean seminar. I guess a little about my context. I'm a kind of cryptographer, cybersecurity verification-y person at Royal Holloway. My interests are basically how we can use software like lean, but there's a lot of other kind of tools in that sort of formal methods-y space to produce more secure cryptographic designs and implementations and all these sorts of things. And lean kind of only targets a small corner of that, but I think it's an important corner. So post-quantum, now I apologize that I was a bit ill and these slides are too wordy. So we're all going to bear with me on a journey. And I don't know much about half of the cryptography I'm going to talk about. So it's going to be a journey we all journey on together. So post-quantum cryptography, or why quantum computers probably aren't going to destroy the world, but they mean we can do a bunch of fun maths. And isn't that the real meaning of life? Yes, if you're a mathematician. What do you know about cryptography? I'm going to not read out all these technical details. I'm going to basically assume, I mean, maybe this isn't true anymore. Maybe in today's modern Bitcoin world, people have much more interest in cryptography. There's only when I did a maths degree some time ago. Basically, you don't learn much about cryptography. You learn a little bit. Probably you learn about RSA encryption. So you might know, I'm going to assume that cryptography can be done using something about multiplying prime numbers, and then you do some sort of Euler-Totient function or something you learn about when you were first learning number theory on your mum's knee or whatever, and you do some inversion of some stuff. Okay, cool. I could go into details here, but basically you might have some existing notion that like modular exponentiation is hard to reverse unless you kind of know your prime factorization of your base, something like this. Okay. And when people say encryption, maybe that's in your model, you're like RSA. Yeah, I did that when I did numbers and sets or whatever. Okay. That was a lie, basically, when they told you that with cryptography, and that doesn't even work anyway for technical reasons, because the same, you couldn't possibly do it like that, because then the same message would always encrypt as the same ciphertext. It's trivially possible to prove. That's very attackable. So you actually, in practice, cryptography always has a bunch of technical detail. But kind of putting all that aside, the hard problem there, often cryptography really comes down to there's some hard problem, and what is the hardness in that kind of thing I just alluded to? It's usually called the hardness of factorization. And maybe you know this fact, that somehow cryptography is all based around factorizing big numbers. It's not really true, but it's sort of true. We are getting quite good at factorizing numbers every day. The number theorists seem to come up with better stuff. People turn it into algorithms. We get really good about that kind of thing now, but it is still hard. We need bigger and bigger RSA keys to be secure-ish, but it's still kind of hard. Now, okay, but actually, that's only half the story, even for the current generation. I haven't talked about quantum stuff yet. That's even only half the story for the current generation of cryptography. So here is the discrete logarithm problem. Okay, if I give you an arbitrary finite group G, I sort of just pluck G out of the Platonic realm and hand it to you, and I give you an element with it. What does that mean? Actually, problems like let's agree on a group we're going to choose. Actually, that can be quite tricky even in itself computationally. But put that aside. Okay, so I'm going to pick some integer k and then raise my element or add it to itself, depending on whether it's a multiplicative or additive group, but whatever. I'm going to raise it to the kth power, and I'm going to give you a. And I'd like you to tell me, okay, what power did I raise that fixed element to? And that's basically like doing a logarithm, right? You're sort of trying to solve the problem of what is the power I raised b to get the thing that you have. But it's a discrete logarithm, because this is all happening in a kind of discrete world of groups rather than the real numbers where I can just stick my log into a calculator. And I claim with no evidence That's very hard. It's very hard to find this kind of discrete logarithm. We certainly can't find any quick way of doing it on a computer. In practice, G might be some multiplicative group of integers, but more likely it's a well-chosen elliptic curve. Why might you want to do that? Because I mentioned this problem of, oh, well, what group are you choosing? And the problem is that, like, what you want is for this problem to be basically as hard as for like an abstract group. You don't really want like the particular structure of your group to like make the problem easier. And for elliptic curves, which I'll mention in a second if you don't know what those are, that's okay. But like it turns out basically if you do stuff like multiplying over the integers, or if you choose too simple a group, like clearly in some sense, if I choose the integers modulo p and I add 1 to itself a bunch of times and then give you p, you can somehow, that's quite easy to reverse, because I just go, well, it's the thing you gave me. So clearly there are better and worse choices of your group here, but you want to choose something that works pretty generically and maybe have some rigorous notion of what pretty generic means. So how can we make cryptography out of this? Well, basically in 1976, Diffie-Hellman invented, they didn't, public cryptography and changed the world, they didn't, but like these things are kind of sorted through. Actually, I think GCHQ had already invented a bunch of this stuff, but they didn't tell anyone, so they don't get the credit. So here's an idea. Both agree on this group G, okay, and some fixed B. I'm going to choose an integer S at random. You choose an integer R at random. You send me B to the R. I send you B to the S. And now basically I kind of, whatever you've given me, I do my thing too, and whatever I've given you, you do your thing too. And because these operations commute in a kind of nice way, what we have at the end is kind of the same thing, and therefore we've agreed some shared secret, but actually it would be really hard. It would be hard for someone intercepting that halfway through to break into, because that would amount to solving the discrete logarithm problem, which we've agreed with no evidence is very hard. Clearly, there's a lot of technical detail I'm eliding here. I call this the miracle because I literally have heard cryptographers say this. Like, for reasons I'm about to explain, we're kind of moving out of the world where you can do this thing with this maths because quantum computers will make this redundant. Which is a shame because this particular construction, which lets you kind of swap stuff and do your thing to it, but in a different context, lets you build a lot of different kinds of cryptography to it from it. Whereas some other stuff can be like less flexible in terms of how you can use it.
I have a totally stupid question.
Sure.
I know that you can factor quickly on a quantum computer, but can you solve discrete log quickly?
Yes, you can, and those are basically are the same problem. They turn out they basically have the same there's a thing called the hidden subgroup problem, which is basically like, oh, I can't remember the technical detail. Basically they are both instances of the same underlying hard problem that there is a good algorithm for on quantum computers.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, it's a really great question. Yeah, so that's kind of, I think have I said it? Yeah, I mean I'll say it again in a second, but yes, basically the problem is going to be that most public key cryptography is basically based off that we actually use, that I'm using right now, because there's some kind of secure communication between me and Zoom and between you and everything else. On some level, that's using elliptic curve cryptography, which is basically going to be using something like the discrete logarithm somewhere, or it's going to be using RSA maybe. And that's pretty much your two choices. Or you're using some kind of nonsense thing that was broken years ago, but hopefully that's not the case. Unfortunately, as Kevin just said in his question, thanks, Kevin, for saying that for me, quantum computers, whatever that is, we'll talk about that in a second, can solve this stuff quite quickly. Okay, so why is this relevant to Lean? Okay, I want to sort of maybe I'm going to talk about cryptography, and then every now and then I'm going to bring it back to Lean. So I basically just talked about two kinds of public key crypto. It's desirable. I claim to be able to make formal claims and prove things about the properties of crypto schemes. Now, actually, in some ways, Lean is not the best tool for that because there are better specific tools for things. But like, I think we can probably agree that if you want to be able to make claims about a thing, we better have a good kind of mathematical model and understanding and be able to prove theorems about that thing. And like, basically in Lean, we mostly have the mathematics necessary to model these forms of cryptography, apart from elliptic curves are very hard because to do them properly, you need a big part of algebraic geometry, I think. I'm just getting flashbacks to reading Silverman during my masters. And if you do them the wrong way, it's just a large part of algebra, and nobody likes it, and you probably can't get a nice, like, simple lemma to do it all for you. which is a shame because elliptic curves, you know, for a lot of modern public key crypto happens. So we probably should have elliptic curves. Someone should go do it. Get you reading this. Go do this right now. We haven't already.
You believe that it's associative, right? The group law. You believe that the group law is associative.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to believe that.
Can't I just sorry the proof?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll just do that. Yeah, exactly. No, I don't really know what you need to do. But the point, I think what I'm trying to say is that basically kind of all this maths is not very hard maths. I guess elliptic curves are kind of hard, but none of it is like super advanced.
It's MSc, right?
Say again?
It's MSc level, which is the level of this seminar. MSc and above. So.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, it's elliptic curves MSc level, maybe, but like I feel like multiplying prime numbers together probably isn't. Basically, the maths that cryptographers often tend to do is very algebraic, it's very highly structured, and so it's kind of amenable to theorem provers. But often cryptography ends up, you've got some data and then you reinterpret a different context. So you end up with just a large cryptographers, even maybe more so than mathematicians, just they love coercing types. They love treating something like it's something else. And that makes stuff sometimes a real headache to do some formalization about. I'm not talking here about any kind of security property or anything. There is a whole other area about how you formally prove security properties of things, or formally prove like algorithm kind of speed or whatever. You can do stuff there, but like I really don't think they have the framework for that and doing that right now. I'm just really talking about how we would actually model the actual mathematics, and specifically about some of the bleeding edge stuff that will replace the stuff we're currently talking about. And I kind of want to sketch what I think the lean looks like for at least some of that, because that's kind of what I've been working on for a little bit. Oh, hang on, there's some messages in the chat. I don't know if I should. Okay, yeah, fine. Okay, so post-quantum cryptography. What's a quantum computer? I don't know. It's something. Quantum mechanics is some bullshit. Sorry. Quantum mechanics is some nonsense that the physicists assure me is definitely true, and apparently, like, actually is, which is unfortunate because I don't like living in a reality that works like that. But it is the case, and we can build quantum computers out of it maybe someday. And these can be used to sort of solve these problems. Now, I mean, quantum computers are probably decades away, so you might want to ask, why do I care? I mean, this feels like a future me problem, and in many cases it is, yeah. But like, you might want to think about, if I'm sending a message today, do I care about it being read in 20 years? Now, for my texts, for my communication with Just Eat asking for a curry, I'm good. That's fine. If the future want to read that, that's fine. But we probably are sending some messages, and certainly governments and large companies and very powerful organizations may indeed want to send information that they don't want to be read down the line. That if I'm just sort of sitting somewhere recording a bunch of stuff, I don't want someone to like go to it in 20 years with their big shiny new quantum computer and then break that stuff and read what I was saying 20 years ago. So kind of the theory is we really should be thinking now about what cryptography will replace our current cryptography. This is cryptography, by the way, what we're doing on a normal computer, not on a quantum computer, just so that if down the line someone does have a working quantum computer that actually works, and that is a big if, but they might well, that's actually a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, as they say in the field, we should probably switch to something that we're definitely sure is going to be secure. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, have been running a process for about 5-6 years now to sort of standardize some new cryptography. Today, they were a bunch of kind of candidates, sort of people who proposed in the literature or whatever, and they were basically initiating a process to sort of agree on like what the next generation was going to look like. And that they have been saying for nearly half a year that any day now they're going to announce the results of that process. Maybe they've done it while I'm talking, but I'm not prepared to bet on that. So okay, I want to talk about, there's kind of a zoo of different candidates, and I want to talk about them at least on the very high level of what kind of maths they enroll. Because that obviously, as mathematicians, that is maybe what we care about. So here are some different kinds of post-quantum cryptography. There kind of are others, and this is very high level, but like this is a broad themes. So we have what's called lattice-based cryptography, which is very popular. Everyone loves lattice-based cryptography. It's almost like too popular, because that means people keep finding little ways to break it or make it at least a little quicker. One of the reasons it's very popular is you can use it to build kind of quite exotic things, including homomorphic encryption, which is actually almost exactly what it sounds like. It's encryption where I encrypt some ciphertext, and then I do some operations on it and then decrypt it, and I get the result of I get the result as if I had done those operations on the encrypted information, but I never had access to it when I was doing that information. And that's relevant because, standard example, I want you to do some machine learning on some data, but this data is medical data or something that's very secure. So but you, Amazon AWS, have a big web server. So I give you a big pile of my data encrypted. You do some big calculations on it with your massive computer, and then you give that back to me, and then I decrypt it again. So the lattice stuff, basically because of the nice mathematical properties that it has, emits that. So everyone likes that, very exciting. Code-based cryptography, which uses coding theory, which is basically kind of almost its whole other thing, because the theory of how we set up things like how we send information over a noisy channel, which again we're using right now, is basically what, okay, in practice actually electronic communication isn't perfect, so how do we fix things so that we don't lose information? Turns out you can base some interesting cryptography on this. Like, there's some very venerable candidates here. There's one of the key candidates here, which I'll talk about, was proposed in like the 70s. But it's not like new stuff. It's just that we didn't have a reason to do it when we were in nice, happy, we can use Diffie-Hellman world. Just that this stuff does appear to be quantum resistant. Multivariate cryptography, which I'm not going to talk much about because it's the one primary candidate of this, recently had a paper which was breaking Rainbow in a weekend on a laptop. And basically, if your crypto scheme admits a paper about it called breaking this crypto scheme in a weekend on a laptop, people very quickly, even if you have a fix for that problem, people very quickly go, I am less confident in this crypto scheme. So there's some interesting stuff there. Basically, it's about big multivariate functions and stuff, and why they can be hard to work with. But I'm not going to talk much about it. Isogeny-based cryptography, which is like elliptic curve cryptography on speed. Mathematicians tend to love this. It's a little bit like something like homotopic type, like one of those areas where basically people get like really into it, and then they wear t-shirts or really want to tell you about it all the time. Isogeny-based cryptography is like that. It's very attractive to mathematicians, but the math's lovely. So obviously I will be talking about that. Hash-based and zero knowledge proof-based. I know less about this stuff. And also this is stuff that's not really based necessarily on like number theory. Often it's just based on really cryptographic only objects. I'm not really going to talk about this because it's a lot less interesting from the perspective of a mathematician. I think there is some stuff one could do there, but maybe not as much to say. So I want to talk mainly about lattices, code-based cryptography, and isogenies. I'm only going to give you a little brief preview of what each of those is about, and I'll talk a little bit about vaguely how much of that stuff I think is currently in Lean, and then we'll sort of wrap up at the end. I'll give you some takeaways. That's the goal for the next little while. Okay, so lattice-based cryptography. It's not really my area, and it's really technical. So I'm going to give this a very high level and not get into many variations. But basically, when you hear lattice here, although this picture is a lie, what you should think is like something like it's a module and a ring which embeds into a vector space over the ring's field of fractions, or something like that. Generalization of the idea of the picture on the right. Somehow, we have some like lattice of points, but they kind of sit in a wider context, and that lattice of points is over a module. In this case, maybe it's over some basis of z, but actually we're kind of thinking it sits in a wider space, so it's meaningful to talk about points which are near to points on the lattice but aren't in the lattice. And obviously, in a very concrete, I'm looking at the flat page way, we've got an easy picture of that, but we can generalize all these concepts in lots of different ways. So here are some hard problems that exist in the lattice field, out of which you can eventually build cryptography. Although how you build that out, it can be quite tricky to describe, so I'm not going to try. So, for example, I've got some n-dimensional lattice, and we think here maybe as like I've got like some lattice which is like a n-dimensional space sitting in. It's like a lattice sitting in n-dimensional Euclidean space, maybe, or something like that. Or maybe I don't want to do in real numbers, but I mean some suitable approximation or something. And I want to find some basis that sort of somehow minimizes the maximum size of. I want to find like a small basis somehow. And it turns out that you can that is hard, and it turns out you can use that hardness to do cryptography with it. Okay, here's another example, and this is going to be important because it's actually a little analogous to the code stuff I'll mention in a second. I'm thinking of some point in my lattice, I think, yeah, which maybe you should think of as like z to the n or z to the n, z mod q to the n or something like that. But it might not be. It might be something more exotic. Sometimes it's like a polynomial. Actually, the more exciting and recent stuff is more like actually these rings are polynomial rings, and there's some abstract notion of closeness, some nonsense happens. But basically, if I let you just ask for arbitrary pairs, I'm going to randomly pick matrices, and I'm going to give you that matrix times my kind of vector I'm thinking of. And I'm going to give you both the matrix and the product of the multiplication. Can you then recover my vector? Yes, that's pretty easy, because matrix inversion is pretty easy, and most matrices you're going to choose are invertible. But if I say, oh, okay, I'm going to give you my matrix, and I'm going to give you the matrix product, but I'm going to add a little error. I'm going to sort of say, oh, what I've sent you might be is kind of mostly correct, but maybe it's not quite correct. And I'm going to bound the size of that error. It's going to be random, so you know kind of quite a lot about it. But then actually, unless you have some secret information, it is hard to recover this S. And actually, this is a general theme you see in lots of different cryptography. That's quite an interesting general notion. Linear inversion, pretty easy. Very easy, kind of the definition of a thing I can just ask a computer to do. But linear inversion, but I'm going to impose some kind of fuzziness or error condition on, suddenly starts to be very, very hard. And that is often the route to making some cool cryptography. Okay.
So this is quantum computer hard as well.
Yes, exactly. It is also quantum computer hard. How you assert something as quantum computer hard is quite tricky to explain. Like basically the reason it's quantum computer hard is that although there is a good algorithm for like factorizing discrete logarithm stuff, it's actually quite hard to get good quantum algorithms, and we simply don't have them for this, and they turn out to be much harder to break in. Basically they're much harder. The standard is that sometimes used is that, you know, it should be like this much harder in a conventional sense, which gives you some estimate of how hard it is in a quantum way. There's actually a substantial amount of debate among like high-level practitioners, like among like top level people in the field about like, what does it actually mean to say something is quantum hard, because we don't really have maybe the best security notions for that. So I am sort of brushing a lot of controversy under the rug here. But yeah, these problems are hard in a quantum computer sense, as well as being hard to run on your laptop or on your heavy-duty supercomputer or whatever. Okay, so lean. There's a bunch of notions. Let's say I wanted to don't talk about security stuff or whatever, but let's say I just wanted to go, okay, cool, lattice cryptography. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to define a bit of mathlib, and we're going to have all of lattice cryptography in lean. How hard would that be to do? So in theory, lean knows about most of these objects, I think. You know, we've got polynomials, we've got modules, we kind of know what these things are. In practice, however, difficult to get started with defining a lot of this stuff. Why? Cryptographers tend to use this kind of random notion or use of random errors quite a lot, or, oh, well, I'm going to make this a Gaussian a normal distribution, but obviously it's discrete. So I'm going to truncate that. Lots of stuff that gets really fiddly. And on paper, or when you're doing cryptography where half the maths is hidden under an inequality anyway, maybe you don't care about that fiddliness, but it can make it a real pain for formalization. And so that can be a real pain point. And often, you know, often this stuff is like about specific recipes and specific constructions. And that mixes quite badly with the kind of way you like to do things in maths, though, which is do everything as generally as possible. Try not to be like, you know, don't talk about fin n, talk about fin sets, all of this kind of stuff. That can end up not playing nicely with some of the stuff you want to do here. And also some of this stuff like approximate equality up to rounding. I mean, I think ultimately it shouldn't be a problem to deal with. I mean, certainly we can do analysis in lean, so it should be fine. But I think it can kind of be a pain to work with. But, you know, there are some highly algebraic constructions here, and like more exotic stuff like homomorphic encryption. It would be really cool to be able to, because those constructions can be very elaborate. You really want to make sure they're definitely correct. And kind of, again, they're sort of proving algebraic properties. And so you feel like it is the kind of thing that I could, you know, I could write down some lean theorem and prove it about it. So maybe that's possible. But so it sort of feels, lattice cryptography, I sort of put in the middle ground and stuff I want to talk about. It feels like we kind of seem to have most of the stuff if you want to describe these concepts, but I'm not sure it all would fit together. And certainly I would, and it can get very technical very quickly, which means there's quite a high barrier to entrance for learning. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the one which is probably nearest and dearest to my heart, because it's what I am nominally, touch wood, getting a PhD in it, which is formalizing stuff about code-based cryptography. So what's code-based cryptography? I'm not going to get too much into the details, but a linear code basically is just a subspace of some finite vector space over a finite field. Very often just a finite field of 2 elements. Very boring. It's just 0 and 1. Very easy to encode on a computer. So conceptually, we sort of think of vectors in our vector space are like kind of code words. So I'm sending a message of some length, but I want to add in a bunch of redundant bits so that if there's some corruption along the way, you can correct for errors. And that's kind of how communication over noisy channels work, but also we can kind of use it cleverly for cryptography. So there's a bunch of schemes actually even in this competition that use code-based stuff. But the one that's like almost definitely going to be nailed on picked is one called classic McEliece. And the reason it's going to be nailed on picked is that classic McEliece has been around in some form since the 1970s. And people have been trying to break it for a long time, and occasionally they succeed a little bit, but not in any significant way. And although it's a very conservative choice in the small c sense of you're really, there's always trade-offs here about like how big my public keys are or how quick stuff is to do. And there are reasons why it's not very advantageous, or it's not a very whizzy scheme, or it's not very flexible, but it definitely would get the job done, and we definitely think it's secure. And so classic McEliece is almost certainly going to be picked, but it's not very exciting to, I think, a lot of people. Unlike Lattice, it's very exciting, lots of grant money there, or at least there was a few years ago. So classic McEliece, not going to go, I'll say, into too much of the details here, but the idea is you can take these things called Gopher codes, which I think have some general algebraic geometry definition, but we often think in the special case of like over binary fields or something. You define this subspace that we're thinking about, which sort of will correspond, the subspace is going to correspond to my book of code words. It's going to be the kernel of the matrix, which is basically based on, I get some irreducible polynomial, and I get against a bunch of points on which it's not 0, and you can sort of nicely extract out of that a sensible, like a sensible kind of set of vectors, which are going to be the kernels of some map. I'm allowing into detail because it doesn't really matter what I'm saying here. The idea of linear codes, they have these error correction properties. So error here doesn't mean error in the sense of like a small perturbation in the Euclidean sense away. It's going to mean in the sense of like the Hamming distance. So basically the number of entries in your vector that are wrong, or and of course in the binary sense that means you flipped a bit. And basically the idea here is, in general, for arbitrary linear codes, it's really hard to just decode stuff if there's some errors involved. But if your code has a lot of structure, then there are often very quick ways or efficient ways of decoding. So what you can do is sort of go, I'm going to encode something using a structured code, then I'm going to shuffle that structure together, and I'm not going to tell you what that structure was or what my shuffling was. And then like we can use the error property to like encode our message in the errors we send, but then actually I secretly have the recipe to sort of make those errors easy to find again. That's the very, very, very high level description of that. Mostly here, this is just linear algebra. Like it's linear algebra with some stuff about with a bit of polynomial theory. And I think in the abstract sense, there's a lot more polynomial theory, but there's not like tons. So I claim this should actually be even easier than Lattice. We really don't need much, and it's definitely all stuff that like math describes very well. In fact, of course, it's harder. There's others who just have it. I've been working on putting some coding theory with an eye to again of getting to the code-based cryptography into Lean. And again, the problem is often that it's extremely concrete, and stuff is people often like index stuff over thin or whatever, and doing stuff like in generality, which is often where we want to be to do stuff properly and Lean. You kind of want to find the right approach. Or I mean, basically, I've kept moving in directions, having to go back and change definitions in the normal sort of way. You can get a little bit of progress here. Koch has a description of code-based cryptography, so clearly Lean should also do, right? I feel like if they could do that, then we should be able to do that. But that's I think in one. I'm not even sure that's in like the main math comp. It's like an extension to that. So it's not part of like a big monorepo, but it's definitely in the realms of extremely doable. Okay, now I want to talk about a form of cryptography that's not doable at all in formalization yet. That's Isogeny-based cryptography. Okay, here's the very, very broad idea here. Okay, so you've got elliptic curves, which are fancy curves. Okay, algebraic varieties or something, I guess, maybe if you're that way inclined. They have things called isogenies between them, which I think I understand to be like one of the natural things you can talk of as your morphisms here. Basically, they're like surjective maps with finite kernel, but don't worry too much about the details here. But it sort of means that kind of, you've got a world of elliptic curves, and then you've got graphs of isogenies between them because it's an equivalence relationship. So it doesn't matter which direction we go in. We can sort of think about traveling between isogenous elliptic curves along different isogenies. And it turns out that if you choose nice finite fields that the elliptic curves are defined over, and you choose nice classes of curves, then these isogeny graphs have like a really nice deep structure that are quite nice to do kind of cryptographic-esque operations on. Then it all gets linked to like deeper graph theory and quaternions, and it gets a bit beyond me, but basically that's why mathematicians love this stuff. So the nice thing about this stuff, the thing that gets people a bit excited, is that actually this stuff, you can do things that feel a bit like Diffie-Hellman on them. And I said before, the reason that's very nice is that in the pre-quantum world, as it were, that gives you quite very flexible stuff. So the reason cryptographers get very excited about isogeny-based stuff, because if it can be made to work and doesn't have any vulnerabilities, and it's probably the youngest of any of these forms of crypto, it probably would admit some really interesting constructions. That's why people like it. So what would that kind of look like? I'm going to give you a sketch here, though it really requires kind of sitting down for some substantive time and just kind of thinking about it. Basically, the idea is the two of us agree on some elliptic curves to start off, and we're going to choose it and over a field that has two nice big 2 to the n and 3 to the m torsion subgroups, or in general big prime power subgroups to different prime powers. Yeah, I'm going to do a random walk on the isogenies over, say, the 2 isogenies, and you do some random walk on the 3 isogenies. You might want to think about, I'm massively waving hands here. How do I do a random work on isogenies? What are you talking about, Wrenna? Valid questions, but you can solve these issues. And so now we both end up at some other elliptic curve. And we can sort of swap elliptic curves, which is kind of the same as swapping the kernel of the isogeny that we've built up by doing our random walk. And we can then like do our original random walk on the curve we receive by kind of switching it analogously by using the fact that we have the kernel representation of the curve, and it all works out nicely, but it can be a bit technical to explain. But essentially,
is n huge here? Is that the idea?
Say again.
Is n and m?
Oh yeah, n and m are like massive. Yeah, obviously if they were like small, this wouldn't work. Yeah, they're like very big. So so you kind of have this you have this 2 isogeny kind of graph, and you're kind of traveling on that. And then I basically then I make a walk on that, and then you give me where you got to doing that on the 3 graph. And then I do basically like an analogous walk, because these graphs are like 3 regular or whatever, or 4 regular in this case, or something like that. Like it is sensible to talk about doing the same thing, but from a different place. And you do that, and essentially one can prove that the elliptic curve you end up at the end is not the same in the sense of the same equation or anything, but they will be isomorphic. So in particular, if you know your elliptic curves, they will have the same J invariant. And so you can treat that as a shared secret and the basis of secret communication. And so this is analogous to Diffie-Hellman in the sense that it's like, I do a thing, you do a thing, we swap round, and then we do kind of the analogy of our thing on the new thing. And then we kind of get to a place where we're in sort of the same place up to isomorphism, or same enough that we can extract some secret from it. And that's analogous to Diffie-Hellman. And it's really nice if we can do that kind of construction, because as I say, it admits not the nice forms of cryptography. So from the lean point of view, let's say, okay, let's say you're one of these mathematicians who gets really into this stuff. Can I do isogenies in lean? I don't know. No, maybe. I mean, we don't even have elliptic curves. But on the other hand, I'm sort of aware that like actually you can do much more abstract, like algebraic geometry or arithmetic geometry, all of this kind of stuff that's not really my area in lean. So maybe actually, because isogenies are more abstract, it would be easier to define some of these notions in lean. I don't know. I feel like it would be super.
We have elliptic curves in the sense that we have y squared equals a cubic.
Sure, but
we haven't proved associativity.
Right, but the point is that here, actually, you don't really want to think about elliptic curves in this sense. When isogeny-based cryptographers talk, they actually are really thinking about elliptic curves more in the sense of curves. Like they import a bunch of, like, you know, the amount of Silverman's theoretic elliptic curves they want to import is like a lot larger, and so
I see.
it sort of feels like you really want to be doing stuff in more generality, because otherwise, because like algebraically, this like you don't want to write down an isogeny algebraically because it's extremely fiddly and horrible. But the theory is really beautiful. And certainly when being able to move into different contexts where you think about stuff, the quaternions for some reason that is to do with, I don't know, super singular or something like that. I don't know, and all this kind of stuff. People get really excited about this stuff. Surely it would be possible to formalize some of this stuff, and there's a lot of energy about it. The people who work in this kind of area are often very mathematically inclined. They get very excited, and there are very accessible introductions people have written out there. It would be really cool if someone could like use this as a roadmap, basically to go, okay, what mathematics would we need in Lean to get from here to there, and use that not as kind of, if you did that, it would not one of these journeys where it wouldn't necessarily be about the destination. Though it would be cool to have isogeny-based cryptography in Lean. But if you wanted like, oh, what exactly of the giant realm of high-level mathematics that's out there, and this stuff is, I would say, about the level of this seminar. It probably is about MSc level or whatever, at least into the theory of it. It's a source of like real-world mathematics that matters to people who aren't just aren't just mathematicians. That's interesting, and it's interesting mathematically. This isn't just, oh, I did some hard computational shuffling and I got some cryptography out. To really understand why isogeny-based cryptography works, you actually really need to appreciate the mathematics. So with this target, I sort of feel like this is probably the one that feels the hardest to do. But like, if you could, it would. I don't think anyone's even started to touch formalizing isogeny-based cryptography in like anything, as far as I'm aware. But it would be a really cool project for someone to get into and take on. I mean, it's not really my thing, but it always feels pregnant with possibility. I just don't know what that possibility is yet. So here are some takeaways from this presentation, and then I'll let you ask some questions. So basically, what you should take away from this is the maths of post-quantum cryptography needs much more advanced mathematics, at least kind of master's level or beyond the stuff which is like the current background of a lot of cryptography we use, where yes, at the high level it will use elliptic curves, but it's nothing that's like super hard. I used to be a maths teacher, and you can explain kind of elementary cryptography to even a school student, but some of this stuff you just couldn't. There's too many concepts you need to put in. And it's desirable to be able to prove the correctness of algorithms, just putting aside any questions of complexity or security. You want to prove that your algorithms are kind of correct and good. And these are something that in theory, a theorem prover of a big mathematical library could be really great at. In Coq, there is a nice library that just does generating like fast assembly code for elliptic curve cryptography. So just like the elliptic curve operations. And that's really useful in that kind of context. But for some of these much harder algorithms, you need a solid grounding in the maths, in the underlying mathematics to be able to produce that kind of thing. Indeed, actually, having said that, I think they actually just do the field operations. There's baby steps, but to be able to get to the end when you're kind of verifying fast algorithms, to begin with, you just need to be able to model the mathematics at all. Basically, some stuff wouldn't actually need that much new maths in MathLib. It's just the technical fuzzy details, which can be really annoying, but isn't like new maths. Some need, I think, probably titanic amounts. But I think cryptography and a lot of bleeding edge cryptography, it probably provides a target-rich environment if anyone wants to like look for relevant maths that they want to put into Lean. And I know some people really kind of care about that or get excited about that. Also, it would be really nice to have complexity and security proofs, but that is a whole different kettle of fish and very hard. So I don't want to talk about that, but it would be nice. Okay. Cool. That's me having talked for 40 minutes about post-quantum cryptography. I was going to open the floor to any questions or points I went over far too quickly or anything like that.
Right. Before you do that, I will stop the recording. But thank you very much indeed. So.
No. Everyone's been. I noticed people leaving as I went along. So